The storm that rolled into Reno, Nevada that October evening in 1883 brought with it more than just rain and thunder. It brought Katherine running through the mud-soaked streets with nothing but a worn carpetbag and desperation in her eyes. Ethan Davis had just finished his evening rounds, checking on the horses in the stable behind his modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, when he heard the frantic knocking on his front door. He was not the type of man who received visitors, especially not at this hour when decent folks were settling in for supper. The ranch he inherited from his late father 3 years ago kept him busy enough that social calls were few and far between, and that suited him just fine. At 26 years old, Ethan had grown comfortable with his solitary existence, finding companionship in his work and the open land that stretched as far as the eye could see. The knocking came again, more urgent this time, and Ethan wiped his hands on his worn denim pants before crossing the wooden floor of his front room. When he pulled open the door, the sight that greeted him was enough to stop his breath. A young woman stood on his porch, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face and neck. Her dress, which might have once been a respectable shade of blue, was now nearly black with rainwater and mud. But it was her eyes that caught him, wide and green and filled with a fear so raw it made his chest tighten. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Please, I need help, just for tonight. I will leave at first light, I swear it." Ethan stood there for a moment, torn between the caution that his father had drilled into him about strangers and the basic human decency that his mother had modeled every day of her life before consumption took her when he was 15. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and he could see the woman shivering violently. "Come in," he said, stepping aside and making the decision in an instant. Whatever trouble she was running from could be sorted out once she was warm and dry. Sarah stepped across the threshold, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. Water pooled beneath her feet on the clean floor, and she looked down at the mess she was making with obvious distress. "I am sorry," she managed to say. "I am so sorry." "Do not worry about the floor," Ethan said, already moving toward the bedroom where he kept his mother's old trunk. He had not opened it in years, but he knew there were still some of her clothes inside. "You need to get out of those wet things before you catch your death." He returned a moment later with a simple cotton nightgown and a thick wool blanket. "You can change behind that screen there," he said, gesturing to the corner of the room where a decorative screen provided privacy. "I will make some coffee and heat up some stew." Sarah took the clothes with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not know what this means." Ethan busied himself in the kitchen area, stoking the fire in the stove and setting the coffee pot on to boil. He could hear the rustle of wet fabric behind the screen, and tried to focus on the task at hand, rather than wonder about the woman who had appeared on his doorstep, like some kind of ghost from a penny dreadful. The stew from last night's supper heated quickly, and by the time Sarah emerged from behind the screen, wrapped in the blanket with her wet clothes bundled in her arms, he had 2 bowls set out on the simple wooden table. "Sit," he said, pulling out one of the chairs. "Eat while it is hot." Sarah sat carefully, as if she was afraid the chair might disappear beneath her. She set her wet clothes on the floor beside her and accepted the bowl of stew with hands that were still shaking slightly. The first spoonful seemed to revive her somewhat, and Ethan watched as color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the steady drum of rain on the roof. Ethan poured coffee for both of them, strong and black the way he liked it, and was surprised when Sarah took hers the same way without asking for milk or sugar. "I am Sarah," she said finally, setting down her spoon. "Sarah Katherine, I owe you an explanation." "You do not owe me anything," Ethan replied, though curiosity was eating at him. "But I would not mind knowing what has you running through a storm like that." Sarah took a long sip of coffee, and Ethan noticed how she closed her eyes as if savoring not just the warmth, but the simple comfort of being safe and dry. When she opened them again, there was determination there alongside the fear. "I was supposed to marry a man in Virginia City," she began, her voice steady now. "Arthur Paulson. My father arranged it before he died last year. Arthur is 43 years old, owns a dry goods store, and seemed perfectly respectable when I first met him 6 months ago. But as the wedding got closer, I started to see things. The way he spoke to his employees, the way he looked at me when he thought I was not paying attention. And then, 3 days ago, I overheard him talking to one of his friends about what he planned to do once we were married. How he would make sure I knew my place, how he had ways of keeping a woman in line." She paused, her hands tightening around the coffee cup. "I knew I had to leave. I took what little money I had saved and bought a ticket on the stage to Reno. I thought maybe I could find work here, start over. But when I got off the stage this afternoon, I saw him. Arthur. He had followed me. I ran, and I have been running ever since. I saw your light, and I just prayed that whoever lived here would have mercy." Ethan felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. He had seen men like that before, men who thought that marriage gave them ownership of another human being. "He will not find you here," he said firmly. "You can stay the night, and in the morning we will figure out what to do next." Relief washed over Sarah's face, and she looked like she might cry again. "Just tonight," she said. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Ethan assured her, though even as he said it, he wondered what he was getting himself into. "You can take my bed." "I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Sarah protested. "You can and you will," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It has been a long day and you need proper rest." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue further but seemed too exhausted to manage it. She finished her coffee and stood, still wrapped in the blanket like a cocoon. "I do not know how I will ever repay your kindness." "Just get some sleep," Ethan said. "That is payment enough." He showed her to his bedroom, a simple space with a solid bed frame that his father had built, and a quilt his mother had sewn. Sarah looked at it, like it was the finest hotel room in San Francisco, and Ethan felt something shift in his chest, some piece of himself that had been closed off for a long time beginning to crack open. After Sarah had closed the bedroom door, Ethan made himself a pallet by the fire with extra blankets from the trunk. He lay there for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about the woman sleeping in his bed. He told himself that in the morning she would leave, go on her way, and his life would return to normal. But even as he thought it, some part of him knew it was a lie. When Ethan woke the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and glistening with moisture. The sun was just beginning to peek over the Sierra Nevada mountains to the west, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He stretched, working out the kinks from sleeping on the floor, and immediately became aware of sounds coming from the kitchen area. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and was greeted by the most unexpected sight. Sarah was up and dressed in her own clothes, which she had apparently washed and dried by the fire during the night. She was standing at his stove, and the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air. "Good morning," she said when she noticed he was awake. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and without the fear and rain masking her features, Ethan could see that she was lovely. Not in a delicate China doll way, but in a way that spoke of strength and character. She looked to be in her early 20s, with a smattering of freckles across her nose and a determined set to her jaw. "You did not have to do this," Ethan said, standing and walking toward the table where she had already set out 2 plates. "I wanted to," Sarah replied, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "It is the least I can do after you took me in last night. I found your stores. I hope you do not mind. I will replace everything once I find work." Ethan sat down at the table, feeling oddly off balance. He had lived alone for 3 years, and in all that time, no one had cooked him breakfast. He had become used to his own simple fare, burnt coffee and whatever he could throw together quickly before heading out to work. This was different. This was domestic and warm and entirely too appealing. Sarah brought the bacon to the table along with eggs she had scrambled and biscuits she must have made from scratch. "I found some flour and lard," she said, sitting down across from him. "I hope that was all right." "It is more than all right," Ethan said, and he meant it. The food was delicious, better than anything he had tasted in years. But more than that, it was the simple act of sharing a meal with someone else, of not eating alone in the quiet of his own company. They ate together, and Ethan found himself watching the way Sarah handled her coffee cup, the way she seemed to savor each sip as if it were something precious. There was something about the way she held it, both hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, that struck him as endearing. "This coffee is very good," Sarah said, noticing his attention. "Did you make it yesterday?" "I did," Ethan replied. "Just the way my father taught me, strong enough to stand a spoon in, he used to say." Sarah laughed, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "My father used to say the same thing. He was a rancher, too, up in Montana. We lost him last winter, and there was not enough money to keep the ranch going. That is why I ended up agreeing to marry Arthur. I thought it was the only option I had." "There are always options," Ethan said quietly. "They might not be easy ones, but they exist." "I am starting to believe that," Sarah said, meeting his eyes across the table. "Thanks to you." After breakfast, Ethan showed Sarah around the property. His ranch was not large by some standards, but it was his, and he had worked hard to keep it running after his father passed. He had about 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and enough land to keep them all fed and healthy. The barn needed some repairs, and the fence line along the southern boundary was sagging in places, but overall it was a good operation for one man working alone. "It is beautiful," Sarah said, standing on the porch and looking out over the land. "You must be very proud." "It is home," Ethan said simply. "The only one I have ever known." They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, and Ethan found himself not wanting the morning to end. He knew he should help Sarah get to town, help her find a place to stay and look for work, but the words stuck in his throat. "I should let you get on with your day," Sarah said finally, as if reading his thoughts. "You have been more than generous, but I need to figure out my next steps." "About that," Ethan heard himself say, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. "I could use some help around here. Nothing permanent, just until you get your feet under you. There is a spare room off the back of the house that my father used as an office. It has a small cot. You could stay there, earn some wages, and have time to figure out what you want to do next." Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. "You barely know me. Why would you offer that?" Ethan shrugged, feeling awkward under her scrutiny. "I barely know you, but I know enough. You are running from a bad situation, and you need a safe place to land. I have the space, and I genuinely could use the help. It makes sense." "People will talk," Sarah said softly. "A woman staying out here with a man, no family around." "Let them talk," Ethan replied with more confidence than he felt. "We will know the truth of it, and that is what matters." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan could see her weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but I want to earn my keep. I will not be a charity case." "I would not have it any other way," Ethan said, and he felt something like relief wash over him. He told himself it was just because he genuinely needed help with the ranch, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The house had felt empty for so long, and having Sarah there, even just for breakfast, had reminded him of what it was like to have someone to talk to, someone to share meals with. They spent the rest of that day working together. Sarah proved to be more capable than Ethan had expected, handling the chickens with ease and helping him muck out the stalls without complaint. She had clearly grown up on a ranch, understanding the rhythms and requirements of the work without needing much instruction. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Sarah had prepared, Ethan found himself watching her again. The way she moved through his kitchen, now slightly more familiar with where things were kept. The way she poured coffee for both of them without asking, somehow remembering exactly how he took it. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, catching him staring. "Just that it has been a long time since this house felt lived in," Ethan admitted. "I had not realized how much I missed it until today." Sarah's expression softened. "I know what you mean. After my father died, the ranch felt so empty. It was too big for just me, too full of memories. I thought leaving would help, but I just ended up more lost." "You feel lost now?" Ethan asked. Sarah considered the question, taking a sip of her coffee. "No," she said finally. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I might have found something. I am not sure what yet, but something." Over the following weeks, a routine developed between them. Ethan would wake before dawn and start the coffee, but within a few days, he would find Sarah already in the kitchen, the coffee brewing and breakfast well underway. She was always up before him, as if she was determined to prove her worth. They would eat together, discussing the work that needed to be done that day, and then head out to tackle their respective tasks. Sarah took over the kitchen garden, which had been neglected since Ethan's mother passed. She weeded and replanted, bringing new life to the small plot behind the house. She also took charge of the chickens and started making cheese from the milk of their 2 cows. Every evening, they would sit down to dinner together, and afterward, they would often end up on the front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. Ethan found himself looking forward to these evenings more than he cared to admit. Sarah was easy to talk to, with a quick wit and a perspective on life that he found refreshing. She had a way of seeing humor in difficult situations, and her laugh became something he found himself trying to coax out whenever possible. One evening, about 3 weeks after Sarah had arrived, they were sitting on the porch as usual when she suddenly said, "Tell me about your parents." "What were they like?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking comfortably beneath him. "My father was tough but fair. He believed in hard work and honest dealing. He built this ranch from nothing, just a small claim and a lot of determination. My mother was the heart of this place. She could make a feast out of practically nothing, and she never turned away anyone who needed help. I think that is why I opened the door to you that night. I could hear her voice in my head, telling me it was the right thing to do." "I wish I could have met them," Sarah said quietly. "I wish you could have too," Ethan replied, and he meant it. He could picture his mother taking to Sarah immediately, appreciating her work ethic and her spirit. His father would have approved too once he saw how capable she was. "What about your family?" Ethan asked. "You mentioned your father, but what about your mother?" "She died when I was 12, Sarah said, her voice taking on a distant quality. "Fever took her one winter. It was just me and my father after that. He did his best, tried to teach me everything I would need to know. But when he died, I panicked. I thought I needed a man to take care of me. It took running from Arthur to realize that I am capable of taking care of myself." "You are more than capable," Ethan said firmly. "You have been a godsend around here. I do not know how I managed before you came." Sarah turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes seemed to glow. "Do you really mean that?" "Every word," Ethan said, holding her gaze. Something passed between them in that moment, something electric and unspoken. Ethan felt his heart rate pick up, and he found himself leaning slightly toward her before he caught himself and pulled back. "I should turn in," Sarah said quickly, standing up from her chair. "Early morning tomorrow." "Right," Ethan said, feeling the moment slip away. "Sleep well." After Sarah had gone inside, Ethan sat on the porch for a long time, staring out at the dark landscape. He was in trouble, he realized. Somewhere along the way, without him quite noticing when it happened, Sarah had become more than just a hired hand. She had become essential to his daily life in a way that went far beyond her help with the chores. He looked forward to their morning coffee together more than anything else in his day. He found himself working faster in the afternoons, so they could have more time together in the evenings. And when she laughed at something he said, it felt like winning a prize. The next morning, Ethan woke to the now familiar smell of coffee and found Sarah in the kitchen as usual. But this morning felt different somehow, charged with the energy from the night before. They moved around each other carefully, both seeming aware of the shift between them but not quite sure what to do about it. "I need to go into town today," Ethan said as they sat down to breakfast. "We are running low on supplies, and I need to pick up some things from the general store." "Would you like to come with me?" Sarah hesitated, and Ethan could see the fear flash across her face. "What if Arthur is still there? What if he sees me? Then I will deal with him," Ethan said, his voice hard. "You cannot hide forever, Sarah, and you should not have to. You have done nothing wrong." Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. "You are right. I cannot spend my whole life afraid. I will come with you." The ride into Reno was pleasant, the November air crisp but not yet cold. They took Ethan's wagon, and Sarah sat beside him on the bench seat, close enough that their shoulders occasionally bumped as they navigated the rough road. Ethan found himself intensely aware of her presence, the way she held onto the side of the wagon when they hit a particularly rough patch, the way the wind caught strands of her dark hair and made them dance around her face. Reno was bustling with activity when they arrived. The town had grown considerably in recent years, becoming an important stop on the railroad line. The streets were crowded with wagons and pedestrians, and the noise was a stark contrast to the quiet of the ranch. They stopped first at the general store, where Ethan helped Sarah down from the wagon. He offered his arm as they walked inside, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. The proprietor, Harold Mitchell, was a man in his 50s who had known Ethan since he was a boy. "Ethan Davis," Harold said with a broad smile. "Good to see you, son. And who is this lovely young lady?" "This is Sarah Katherine," Ethan said, feeling suddenly protective. "She is helping out at the ranch." Harold's eyebrows went up slightly, but his smile never wavered. "Well, it is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Katherine. Any friend of Ethan's is welcome here." They spent the next hour gathering supplies, and Ethan noticed how Sarah moved through the store, carefully checking prices and making mental calculations. When they reached the counter to pay, she pulled out a small leather pouch and counted out coins. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked. "Paying for my share," Sarah said firmly. "You have been feeding me for weeks now. The least I can do is contribute to the household expenses." "Sarah, you do not have to do that. I am paying you wages." "Which means I have money to spend," Sarah replied, her chin lifting stubbornly. "Please, Ethan, let me do this." Ethan could see there would be no arguing with her, so he nodded. "All right, but only half. This is my ranch, and I will not have you spending all your earnings on supplies." They compromised, splitting the cost down the middle, and Harold watched the exchange with obvious interest. Ethan could practically see the gears turning in the older man's head, already composing the gossip he would share with the other townspeople. As they were loading the supplies into the wagon, a voice called out from across the street. "Sarah! Sarah Katherine! Is that you?" Ethan turned to see a man striding toward them, tall and well-dressed with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Sarah went rigid beside him, her hand gripping Ethan's arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his shirt. "Arthur," she whispered. The man, Arthur Paulson, reached them with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sarah, my dear, I have been so worried about you. When you disappeared, I thought something terrible had happened. Thank God you are safe." "I am fine," Sarah said, her voice barely steady. "I am sorry I left the way I did, but I cannot marry you, Arthur. I am sorry, but I just cannot." Arthur's smile tightened. "Nonsense. You are just nervous. All brides get nervous before their wedding. Come back to Virginia City with me, and we will talk this through." "She said no," Ethan interjected, stepping slightly in front of Sarah. "The lady has made her choice clear." Arthur finally seemed to notice Ethan, his eyes narrowing as he took in the younger man's protective stance. "And who might you be?" "Ethan Davis." "Sarah works for me." "Works for you," Arthur repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that arrangement. "Sarah, is this really what you want? To be a hired hand on some backwater ranch? I am offering you a respectable life, a good home." "What you are offering is a cage," Sarah said, finding her voice. She stepped out from behind Ethan, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. "I overheard you, Arthur. I know what kind of man you really are. I would rather work 1,000 ranches than spend one day as your wife." Arthur's face flushed dark red, and for a moment, Ethan thought the man might actually try something. His hand moved instinctively to his side, where he wore his father's old Colt revolver. Arthur noticed the gesture and seemed to think better of whatever he had been about to do. "You are making a mistake," Arthur said coldly. "Mark my words, Sarah. You will regret this." "The only thing I regret is not leaving sooner," Sarah replied. Arthur gave them both one last scathing look before turning and walking away. Ethan watched him go, making sure he was really leaving before turning to Sarah. She was shaking, but whether from fear or anger or relief he could not tell. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "I am now," Sarah said, and suddenly she was laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that made Ethan want to gather her into his arms. "I actually did it. I stood up to him." "You did," Ethan said proudly. "You were magnificent." They finished loading the wagon in silence, both processing what had just happened. As they climbed back onto the bench seat and headed out of town, Sarah moved a little closer to Ethan, and this time when their shoulders bumped, she did not pull away. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing with me." "Always," Ethan replied, and he meant it with a fierce certainty that surprised him. That night after dinner, they found themselves back on the porch despite the chill in the air. Ethan had brought out extra blankets, and Sarah had wrapped herself in one, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Do you ever think about the future?" Sarah asked. "About what you want your life to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now?" Ethan considered the question. "I used to think I had it all figured out. Keep the ranch running, maybe expand the herd a bit. It seemed like enough. But lately, I have been thinking that maybe there could be more." "More like what?" "Like this," Ethan said, gesturing between them. "Like having someone to share it all with, someone to have morning coffee with and talk to at the end of the day, someone who makes this house feel like a home again." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside the house. "Ethan, what are you saying?" He took a deep breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff but unable to stop himself. I am saying that I cannot imagine my mornings without you anymore. I wake up thinking about having coffee with you. I work faster so we can spend more time together in the evenings. And when you laugh, it is like the whole world gets brighter. I know it has only been a month, and maybe that is not enough time to really know someone, but Sarah, I know enough. I know that I do not want you to ever leave. I know that I am falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, and Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he waited for her response. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I came here with nothing," she finally said. "Running from one mistake and terrified I would make another. I told myself I would never depend on a man again, that I needed to be independent. And then you opened your door in the middle of a storm and gave me shelter without asking for anything in return. These past weeks, you have shown me what it means to be partners with someone rather than property. You have never once made me feel like I owed you anything beyond honest work. And somehow, without me quite realizing when it happened, I fell in love with you too." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You love me." "I do," Sarah said, a smile breaking across her face. "I love the way you take your coffee black because you think adding anything to it is wasteful. I love how you talk to the horses like they are people. I love that you fixed the leg on that chair in the kitchen because you knew it wobbled and you did not want me to fall. I love 1,000 little things about you, and I love the big things too. I love how kind you are, how decent. How safe you make me feel." Ethan reached out and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. "I cannot promise you an easy life. Ranching is hard work, and there will be lean times along with the good. But I can promise you that I will always respect you, always listen to you, and always make sure you have a voice in every decision we make. If you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing to stay." "That sounds like a proposal, Mr. Davis," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with tears and joy. "I suppose it is, Miss Katherine. Will you marry me? Not because you need me to take care of you, but because we are better together than we are apart." "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Ethan stood, pulling her up with him, and then he did what he had been wanting to do for weeks. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but then Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with a passion that made his head spin. They stood there on the porch, holding each other under the stars, and Ethan felt like the luckiest man alive. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Sarah laughed. "I suppose this means I do not have to sleep in the spare room anymore." "Not unless you want to," Ethan said with a grin, "though we should probably get married sooner rather than later. I do not want to give the town gossips more ammunition than they already have." "How soon is soon?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow if you want, though I suppose we should at least post the banns and do it properly." 2 weeks, Sarah decided. "That gives us time to make arrangements, but not so long that we are tempting scandal." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about how they would arrange the wedding and who they would invite. Ethan had few family members left, but there were some cousins in California who might make the trip. Sarah had no family at all, but she seemed content with that, focused instead on building a new life rather than dwelling on what she had lost. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. They rode into town together to speak with the minister at the small church, a kindly man in his 60s named Reverend Samuel Thompson, who seemed delighted at the prospect of performing a wedding. News of their engagement spread quickly through Reno, and the reaction was mostly positive, though there were a few raised eyebrows and whispered comments about the speed of their courtship. Harold Mitchell at the general store was one of their strongest supporters. "I knew it the moment I saw you two together," he told Ethan when they came in to purchase fabric for Sarah's wedding dress. "You had that look about you, like you had found something you did not even know you were looking for." Sarah chose a simple pattern for her dress, a deep blue that brought out the green in her eyes. Ethan tried to convince her to pick something more elaborate, but she shook her head firmly. "I do not need lace and ruffles. I just need something that makes me feel like myself." In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together planning their future. Ethan showed Sarah the account books, explaining the finances of the ranch and asking for her input on decisions about expanding the herd or making improvements to the property. Sarah proved to have a good head for numbers, catching a few errors in Ethan's addition and suggesting ways they could cut costs without sacrificing quality. "We make a good team," Ethan said one night, watching as Sarah made notes in the ledger with her careful, precise handwriting. "We do," Sarah agreed, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "I never thought I would find this, someone who sees me as an equal who values my opinions." "I could not imagine it any other way," Ethan replied honestly. The night before their wedding, they sat on the porch together as they had so many times before. The air was cold now, December having arrived with a bite, but they were bundled in blankets and sitting close enough that Ethan could feel Sarah's warmth beside him. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked. "About marrying you, not even a little bit," Ethan said. "Are you?" "No," Sarah said, sounding almost surprised. "I thought I would be. When I was engaged to Arthur, I had nightmares almost every night, but with you I just feel peaceful, like I am exactly where I am supposed to be." "You are," Ethan assured her, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "And tomorrow, we make it official." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of perfect winter day that made everything sparkle with frost. Sarah woke early in the spare room, where she had insisted on sleeping the night before to maintain propriety, and dressed in her new blue dress with hands that were steady and sure. She arranged her hair simply, pinning it up and leaving a few curls to frame her face. When she emerged from the room, Ethan was waiting in his best suit, his dark hair combed back and his face freshly shaved. He looked so handsome that Sarah had to catch her breath. "You are beautiful," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not so bad yourself," Sarah replied with a smile. They rode to town together in the wagon, sitting close on the bench seat. The church was small and simple, but someone, probably Harold Mitchell's wife Martha, had decorated it with pine boughs and white ribbons. A handful of people were already there waiting, townspeople who had come to wish them well. Ethan's cousin James had made it from Sacramento, and he greeted them with warm hugs and congratulations. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity, speaking about the importance of partnership and mutual respect in a marriage. When it came time for the vows, Ethan looked into Sarah's eyes and spoke words that came straight from his heart. "I vow to be your partner in all things, to listen when you speak, and to value your thoughts and feelings as much as my own. I promise to make you coffee every morning, even though yours is better than mine. I promise to work alongside you to build a life we can both be proud of. And I promise to love you every single day for as long as I live." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she spoke her own vows. "I vow to stand beside you through good times and hard times, to be your partner and your friend. I promise to bring you coffee in bed when you are sick, and to laugh at your jokes even when they are terrible. I promise to work with you to make our ranch the best it can be, and to build a home filled with love and laughter. And I promise to love you every single day for the rest of my life." When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife and told Ethan he could kiss his bride, the small congregation erupted in applause. Ethan pulled Sarah close and kissed her tenderly, feeling like his heart might burst with happiness. They held a small reception at the church, with cake that Martha Mitchell had baked and coffee that Harold had brewed strong enough to satisfy even Ethan's standards. People came up to congratulate them, and Ethan noticed how Sarah handled the attention with grace, thanking everyone for their kind words and good wishes. As the afternoon wore on and they finally made their way back to the ranch, now truly their ranch together, Sarah leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For opening your door that night, for giving me a chance, for seeing me as more than just a burden or a pretty face, for loving me the way you do." "Thank you for knocking," Ethan replied. "For having the courage to run from a bad situation and to take a chance on a stranger, for bringing life back into my house and my heart, for loving me back." When they arrived home, Ethan surprised Sarah by scooping her up into his arms and carrying her across the threshold, making her laugh with delight. He set her down gently in the front room, and they stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of what they had just done settling over them in the best possible way. "I am your wife," Sarah said wonderingly. "You are my wife," Ethan confirmed, pulling her close. "And I am your husband." "I like the sound of that," Sarah murmured against his chest. That night they lay together in the bed that had been Ethan's alone for so long, and he marveled at how natural it felt to have Sarah beside him. They talked in low voices about their plans for the future, about possibly expanding the ranch and maybe, someday, having children. Sarah fell asleep first, her head on Ethan's shoulder, and he lay awake for a while longer, just listening to her breathe and feeling grateful beyond words for the storm that had brought her to his door. The winter passed in a blur of work and companionship. Sarah proved herself time and again to be an invaluable partner, not just in the daily work of the ranch but in planning for its future. She suggested they start raising sheep along with the cattle, pointing out that wool prices were good and they had plenty of grazing land. Ethan was skeptical at first, but he listened to her reasoning and eventually agreed to give it a try. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Sarah often mending clothes or working on embroidery while Ethan read aloud from whatever book they had managed to acquire. They fell into an easy rhythm, each anticipating the other's needs, working together like a well-oiled machine. But it was the mornings that Ethan cherished most. Every single day, he would wake to find Sarah already in the kitchen, the coffee brewing and filling the house with its rich aroma. They would sit together at the table, warming their hands on their cups and talking about the day ahead. It became a sacred ritual, this quiet time together before the demands of the ranch took over. One morning in late February, Sarah had a strange look on her face when Ethan came into the kitchen. She poured his coffee as usual, but her hands were shaking slightly. "What is wrong?" Ethan asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing is wrong," Sarah said, setting down the coffee pot and turning to face him. "In fact, something is very right. Ethan, I am with child." Ethan felt like the floor had dropped out from under him, but in the best possible way. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. I have been feeling poorly in the mornings and my monthly courses have stopped. All the signs are there." Ethan was around the table in an instant, pulling Sarah into his arms and holding her tight. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Sarah, this is wonderful." "You are happy?" Sarah asked, her face pressed against his chest. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Ethan said, pulling back so he could see her face. "You have given me so much already, and now this. I cannot believe how lucky I am." They took the wagon into town that afternoon to see Dr. William Hayes, who confirmed what Sarah already knew. She was about 2 months along, which meant the baby would arrive sometime in late September or early October. The doctor gave them advice about taking care during the pregnancy, and Sarah listened attentively, asking questions and taking mental notes. As they rode home, Sarah seemed pensive. "What if I am not a good mother?" she asked suddenly. "What if I do not know what to do?" "Then we will figure it out together," Ethan said firmly. "Just like we have figured out everything else. You are going to be an amazing mother, Sarah, I have no doubt about that." The months of Sarah's pregnancy were some of the happiest of Ethan's life. He watched in awe as her body changed, as the subtle swell of her belly became more pronounced. He insisted on taking over the heavier chores, much to Sarah's protest, but she eventually agreed to let him handle the things that required more physical strain. They spent the summer preparing for the baby's arrival. Ethan built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and staining it a warm honey color. Sarah sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her face soft with love for the child she had not even met yet. They converted the spare room, the one Sarah had first slept in, into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow. As September approached, Sarah grew more uncomfortable, her belly large and her back aching. Ethan would rub her feet in the evenings and help her find comfortable positions to sleep. Through it all, they still had their morning coffee together, though Sarah had switched to drinking hers with more milk now, finding the strong black coffee too much for her sensitive stomach. On a crisp October morning in 1884, just over a year since Sarah had knocked on Ethan's door in the middle of a storm, she woke him before dawn with a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan," she said calmly, though he could see the tension in her face, "it is time." Ethan's heart leaped into his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been preparing for this moment for months, and he knew what needed to be done. He helped Sarah into a clean nightgown and got her settled in their bed with plenty of pillows. Then he rode hard into town to fetch Dr. Hayes and Martha Mitchell, who had offered to help with the delivery. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Ethan stayed by Sarah's side through all of it, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement even when she was too tired and pain-racked to respond. He had never felt so helpless in his life, watching the woman he loved suffer and being unable to do anything to make it easier. But finally, just before midnight, the baby's cries filled the room. Dr. Hayes worked quickly, and then he was placing a small, squirming bundle into Sarah's arms. "It is a boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A healthy baby boy." Ethan looked down at his son, this tiny person who had not existed in the world an hour ago, and felt tears stream down his face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus, and when Ethan reached out a tentative finger, the infant's tiny hand wrapped around it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Ethan whispered. "He is," Sarah agreed, looking exhausted but radiant. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Ethan knew exactly what felt right. "What about Daniel? Daniel Ethan Davis, after my grandfather." "Daniel," Sarah repeated, testing the name. "I love it. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the world." The weeks after Daniel's birth were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and constant demands. The baby needed to be fed every few hours, and Sarah was recovering from the delivery. Ethan took over as much of the ranch work as he could, often operating on just a few hours of sleep, but he never complained. Every time he looked at his son or his wife, he felt nothing but overwhelming love and gratitude. Their morning coffee ritual changed but did not disappear. Now they took turns holding Daniel while they drank their coffee, often with the baby sleeping peacefully in one of their arms. Ethan found he did not mind the interrupted sleep, or the chaos that a baby brought into their previously orderly life. If anything, it made everything feel more complete. As winter approached again, they settled into a new rhythm as a family of three. Daniel was a generally happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything around him. Ethan loved watching Sarah with their son, seeing the tenderness and patience she showed as she cared for him. It made him fall in love with her all over again. One evening, as they sat by the fire with Daniel sleeping in his cradle nearby, Sarah looked over at Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about that night? The night I showed up on your doorstep, all the time," Ethan admitted. "I think about how close I came to not answering the door. I was tired, it was late, and part of me just wanted to ignore the knocking and go to sleep. But then I thought about what my mother would say, and I made myself answer it. Best decision I ever made." "Best decision I ever made too," Sarah said. "Running to your door instead of anyone else's. I could have knocked on a dozen different doors that night, but I knocked on yours. It was like fate brought me to exactly where I was supposed to be." "I do not know if I believe in fate," Ethan said, "but I believe in us. I believe in what we have built together." "So do I," Sarah agreed, "and I am so grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because they led us here." The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and they were able to expand their operations, adding more cattle and growing the sheep operation that Sarah had suggested. They hired a young man named Thomas to help with some of the heavier work, giving Ethan more time to spend with his growing family. Daniel thrived, growing from a baby into a rambunctious toddler with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. He loved following Ethan around the ranch, his little legs working hard to keep up with his father's longer strides. Ethan taught him about the animals and the land, just as his own father had taught him. When Daniel was 2 years old, Sarah announced that she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the summer of 1886 they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Margaret Rose after both of their mothers, but from the start, everyone called her Rosie. Rosie was different from Daniel in every way. Where he had been a calm baby, she was fussy and demanding. But she had a smile that could light up a room, and from the moment she was born, she had Ethan wrapped around her tiny finger. He loved both of his children fiercely, but there was something about having a daughter that brought out a gentleness in him that surprised even Sarah. As the children grew, their house became filled with noise and laughter. Daniel and Rosie would play together for hours, building forts out of blankets and playing pretend games. Sarah was an attentive and loving mother, but she also made sure the children learned the value of hard work, assigning them age-appropriate chores and teaching them to take pride in a job well done. Through it all, Ethan and Sarah made sure to preserve their morning coffee ritual. No matter how busy life got or how many demands were placed on their time, they always made sure to have those few quiet moments together at the start of each day. It became the foundation of their marriage, this daily reminder to connect and communicate before the chaos of the day took over. When Daniel was 5 and Rosie was 3, they welcomed their third and final child, another boy they named Samuel after Reverend Thompson, who had married them all those years ago. Samuel was a quiet baby, content to observe the world around him with solemn eyes. Ethan joked that he was clearly the thinker of the family, while Daniel was the adventurer and Rosie was the charmer. As their children grew older, Ethan and Sarah made sure to teach them the values that they held dear. They taught them about hard work and honesty, about treating all people with respect regardless of their station in life. They made sure the children understood that their mother was just as important to the running of the ranch as their father was, That partnership and mutual respect were the cornerstones of a good marriage. One morning when Samuel was about 4 years old, making Daniel 9 and Rosie 7, Ethan woke to find the entire family gathered in the kitchen. The children had apparently decided to surprise their parents by making breakfast, and while the kitchen was a disaster of spilled flour and broken eggs, the intent behind it made Ethan's heart swell. "We made you coffee," Daniel announced proudly, holding up a cup that was filled with what looked like muddy water. Ethan took a sip and managed not to wince at the bitter, overbrewed taste. "It is perfect," he lied, and Sarah caught his eye over the children's heads and smiled, both of them remembering that first morning she had made him coffee, how it had been the beginning of everything. As the children grew into young adults, the ranch continued to thrive. Daniel showed a natural aptitude for the cattle operation, spending hours working alongside his father and learning everything he could about ranching. Rosie surprised everyone by developing a talent for breeding and training horses, and by the time she was 15, people were coming from all over Nevada to buy horses she had trained. Samuel, true to his early nature, became the business mind of the family, keeping meticulous records and finding ways to maximize their profits without cutting corners. Ethan and Sarah watched their children grow with pride and a touch of melancholy, knowing that soon enough they would be starting families of their own. But for now, they were still all together under one roof, and Ethan treasured that. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Ethan woke early and made coffee for Sarah, surprising her by bringing it to her in bed. She sat up, her dark hair now streaked with silver, and accepted the cup with a smile that was as warm and genuine as the one she had given him on that first morning. 15 years, Sarah said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I knocked on your door, and sometimes it feels like you have always been in my life." "I know what you mean," Ethan said, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her free hand. "I was thinking this morning about how different my life would be if you had not come here that night. This house would still be empty and quiet. I would still be eating terrible food and drinking even worse coffee. I would not have Daniel or Rosie or Samuel. I would not have you. I cannot even imagine it." "I cannot imagine it either," Sarah said. "You saved me that night, Ethan, not just from Arthur or from the storm, but from a life of fear and limitation. You showed me what it meant to be truly valued and respected. You gave me a partnership instead of ownership. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Ethan corrected gently. "That is what partnership means." They sat there together, drinking their coffee and watching the sun rise through the bedroom window, just as they had done thousands of mornings before. The house around them was starting to wake up, sounds of the children beginning to stir filtering through the walls. Soon the day would begin in earnest, with all its demands and responsibilities. But for this moment, it was just the two of them, connected across the years by love and coffee and a choice made on a stormy night so long ago. As the years continued to pass, Ethan and Sarah watched as their children found love of their own. Daniel married a schoolteacher named Katherine, a practical woman with a kind heart who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the northern edge of the ranch property and started raising cattle of their own, with Daniel working in partnership with his father. Rosie fell in love with a horse trader named Robert who appreciated her talent and skill. They traveled around the region together, buying and selling horses, and Rosie would come home periodically with tales of their adventures that kept the whole family entertained. Samuel, true to his quiet nature, took the longest to find love. But when he was 25, he met a widow named Ellen who was running a mercantile in Reno after her husband passed. They bonded over their shared love of books and numbers, and within a year they were married, with Ellen bringing her young son from her first marriage into the Davis family. As grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with a new generation of noise and laughter, Ethan and Sarah found themselves stepping back from the day-to-day operations, letting their children take over more and more of the work. They remained involved, offering advice when asked and stepping in when needed, but mostly they enjoyed watching their children carry on what they had built together. But through all the changes, one thing remained constant. Every morning, Ethan and Sarah would sit together with their coffee, taking those few quiet moments before the day began in earnest. It had been their ritual for over 30 years now, and neither of them could imagine starting the day any other way. On the morning of their 35th wedding anniversary, Ethan woke to find Sarah already sitting in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee already poured and steaming on the table. She was looking out the window at the land they had worked together for so long, and when she heard him enter, she turned with a smile. "Good morning," she said, and Ethan felt the same flutter in his chest that he had felt on that first morning she had made him coffee. Some things, he thought, never changed. "Good morning," he replied, sitting down across from her and taking his cup. 35 years. Can you believe it?" "Not really," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I still feel like that terrified girl running through the rain. And then I look at everything we have built, all these children and grandchildren, this life we have created, and I am amazed by it all." "I am amazed by you," Ethan said seriously. "Every single day. The way you turned a single night of shelter into a lifetime of love. The way you made this house a home. The way you have loved me and our children so fiercely. I am the luckiest man alive, Sarah Davis." "And I am the luckiest woman," Sarah replied, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Because you opened your door to a stranger in a storm and saw beyond the fear and desperation to the person underneath. Because you gave me a chance to be myself and to build something meaningful. Because you taught me what real partnership looks like." They sat there, hands clasped across the table, drinking their coffee and watching the sun rise over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Around them, the ranch was beginning to wake up. They could hear the sounds of their grandchildren's laughter floating from Daniel's house, the whinny of horses in the corral, the lowing of cattle in the distance. It was the sound of family, of legacy, of a life well lived. "I love you," Ethan said simply. "I loved you the moment you walked through my door, and I will love you until my last breath." "I love you too," Sarah replied, "with everything I am and everything I have, now and always." As they finished their coffee and prepared to start another day, Ethan thought about that stormy October night so many years ago. He thought about how close he had come to not answering the door, how easily he could have missed out on all of this. It was a sobering thought, but also a grateful one. Because he had answered the door, he had let her stay. And in doing so, he had found not just a wife or a partner, but his other half, the person who made him whole. The sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Ethan and Sarah Davis stood together, looking out over the land they had built together and the family they had created. Behind them, the house that had once felt so empty was now filled with the evidence of love and life. Photographs covering the walls and toys scattered across the floor, the sounds and sense of a home that was truly lived in. They had started with nothing but a cup of coffee and a stormy night. They had built an empire of love that would last for generations. And every morning, they would sit together with their coffee and remember how it all began, grateful beyond words for the chance encounter that had changed both their lives forever. The storm that had brought Sarah to Ethan's door had long since passed, but the love it had sparked continued to burn bright, a beacon of hope and partnership that would guide their family for generations to come. And through it all, there was coffee, always coffee, the simple daily ritual that had bound them together from the very first morning and would continue to do so for all the mornings yet to come. Their love story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though those had their place. It was a story of consistency, of showing up day after day, of choosing each other every morning over coffee and every evening on the porch. It was a story of building something together, brick by brick, day by day, until what stood before them was a life neither could have imagined alone but both had created together.